Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Wasielewski, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Today's Overheard podcast is going to discuss a successful American irregular warfare campaign in Burma during World War II that was conducted by the Office of Strategic Services. It will also discuss what this historical operation can teach us about irregular warfare today. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was a unique organization created in June of 1942 by an equally unique person, Major General William, or better known as Wild Bill, Donovan. Donovan, a World War I Medal of Honor winner, had been called upon by President Roosevelt in 1940 to try to expand U.S. intelligence capabilities. His initial title was Coordinator of Information, and his office, known as COI, began to develop an analytical intelligence capability separate from the Army and Navy. After Pearl Harbor, COI was turned into the OSS, with the mission to conduct intelligence and special operations under the guidance of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. OSS would become the forerunner of both the Central Intelligence Agency and U.S. Army Special Forces. Its wartime activities covered a wide range of missions, including intelligence operations, counterintelligence, research and analysis, propaganda, and aiding resistance forces behind the lines in Europe and Asia during World War II. It was this last mission we're going to talk about today, the mission of OSS Detachment 101 in Burma. And here to discuss it with us is Dr. Troy Sacquety, the author of a book on the subject, The OSS in Burma, Jungle Warfare Against the Japanese. Dr. Sacquety is currently the command historian for the U.S. Military Special Operations Command. He earned his PhD in military history from Texas A&M University, and prior to working at Special Operations Command, he spent several years at CIA as an historian and is well known for his research and publications regarding the OSS. Troy, welcome to the Overheard podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Before you and I begin talking about OSS Detachment 101 and its operations in Burma, I want to set the stage a bit for our discussion with a quick review of the strategic situation in Southeast Asia when World War II began. Now, even before Pearl Harbor, Burma, then a British colony, was a strategically vital area. American and British military supplies to the nationalist Chinese, who had been resisting a Japanese invasion of China since 1937, were shipped to China, first to the Burmese port of Rangoon, and then overland via the Burma Road. This was the only Allied supply route into China since all major Chinese ports had been seized by Japan. And one of Japan's key demands in its negotiations with the United States prior to Pearl Harbor was the halting of this aid to China via Burma. After Pearl Harbor, Japan landed troops at Rangoon and conquered all of Burma, shutting down the Allied supply line into China. However, both the British and Americans needed to keep China in the war against Japan, and therefore keep the flow of supplies to Chinese nationalist forces going. Part of the answer was flying these supplies over the Himalaya Mountains, which is an incredible tale in itself, but a separate one. Another part of the answer was to reconquer Burma. Troy, I believe that this is where the OSS came in. Could you please describe how the OSS became involved in the Burma campaign? What were America's strategic goals, and how did Detachment 101 fit into those goals?
Sure, absolutely. So Detachment 101 or Det 101 actually started off as a COI unit. And so it was one of only two special operations units formed under the Coordinator of Information. And it was sent overseas to Burma. One of the reasons being that the COI, later OSS, needed to get into an operational theater. And Burma was one that was begging for essentially attention. And so they formed a very small unit. It was 21 men that went over and were basically sent over to the Far East to see what they could do. Originally, their mission was supposed to be for China, but it became pretty apparent due to politics that they weren't going to be able to operate in China. And so the commanding general of the Northern Combat Area Command, General Stilwell, basically asked for Detachment 101 to set up operations in India. And what he asked for was for Detachment 101 to impact Japanese airfield operations at Michino, which is in the Kachin states up in northern Burma. And so he essentially told the commander of Det 101 that you have 90 days for me to hear booms from the jungle. And that was essentially the operational directive that he gave to the commander, Colonel Eifler, and just left him on his own to figure out how to do that.
Now, did Colonel Eifler have any sort of background in special operations? What was his background?
Sure. So no background in special operations. You have to, remember this is a time that we did not have a special operations capability whatsoever, either in the U.S. Army or the U.S. government. They're pretty much making this up on the fly. But what Eifler did have, he had been a reservist, but had also worked in the U.S. Customs Service. And so he kind of knew some of the techniques for smuggling and thought that he could translate some of his experiences with countering smuggling rings into and use the basically the techniques of the people he was trying to uncover and do the same thing by getting agents and saboteurs into northern Burma.
Well, Stilwell's instructions to him that he had 90 days until he heard something going boom in the jungle was a rather broad, shall we say, mission focused order. Did not seem to be micromanaging him too much. How did he take that order, and how did he end up getting things to go boom in the jungle?
So, and that's a pretty good point with Detachment 101 for the entire war, is that they were not micromanaged. And when I wrote the dissertation on that unit and then later turned it into a book, I went through more than 3,000 boxes in the National Archives of Detachment 101 material. And other than that verbal order from Stilwell, I found no order from OSS Washington, General Donovan, or General Stilwell telling Detachment 101 what to do. So they were just given very broad directives and were allowed to figure on their own how they're going to do that. But to answer your question with that, what Eifler decided initially that he wanted to do was he had two different kinds of missions. One of which he did because he needed to get intelligence on the area, and so he sent some men up to a place called Putao or Fort Hertz, which was the last area of northern Burma that remained in Allied hands, and then tried to get them to walk through Japanese lines to infiltrate through to gather intelligence. And then the second method that he tried was to insert agent teams by parachute deeper into Burma. And with the exception of the first group, which was the A group, every other team was quickly wrapped up by the Japanese, and those particular agents killed. And when I say agents, they recruited personnel, either Anglo-Burmans or Anglo-Indians that had fled Burma when the Japanese came in. So they had a very large population of refugees that they could recruit from, and they were hoping to get people that had been from those areas so they could blend in with the local population. But it just did not work too well.
And what was then Plan B when the initial intelligence operations came up short? How did Colonel Eifler then try to penetrate the Japanese area to understand what was going on?
Sure. So what he did after that is he continued during his command time. He continued to try to get agent groups inserted into Burma, but it was pretty clear through the beginning of 1944 that this was not working too well. So what they also did is they reinforced what I call the short-range penetration missions that did bring initially intelligence, and then later uncovered that there were guerrilla forces that were actively fighting the Japanese that were willing to fight on the American side. In Eifler's case in particular, he landed a group on the lower coast of Burma called the W Group. And when he did that, he had an accident in which he hit his head against rocks, was incapacitated after that as the commander. So he was relieved by General Donovan, who came out to Burma to actually evaluate Eifler's, basically his health. And he was relieved by Donovan. And the number two, who was a gentleman named Ray Piers, took over command. Ray Piers later retired as a lieutenant general. And what Piers did is he reevaluated how they did the operations and really reinforced those shorter range overland penetrations. It focused on less risky operations that they didn't bring dramatic results, like severing lines of communication from Rangoon to Myitkyina, but they still brought those intelligence, and more importantly, that intelligence brought the targets that the 10th Air Force needed to bomb in the thick the thick Burma jungles, where unless you had agents on the ground, they were not going to be able to pinpoint those targets.
Yeah, so like many irregular warfare operations, it starts off first as an intelligence collection operation. And then it's going to start locating targets for either airstrikes or to set up for future operations by other agent teams moving in. Now, speaking of that second part, you mentioned that the short-range reconnaissance teams found a guerrilla movement already fighting the Japanese. Were these the Kachin peoples who were resisting Japanese invasion of their land there in northern Burma?
Yes, so there was a Kachin resistance that was centered around a leader named Zing Tugnal. And with the Kachin in particular, they weren't anti-British, but they were violently anti-Japanese. And when the Americans came in, they found a pretty natural ally because they did not look at the Americans as colonizers and didn't think that the Americans were going to have long-term interest on Burma itself. In this regard, they were also helped by American missionaries that had been in that area for generations before. And these missionaries had actually taken the Kachin language or Jingpo and given it a written language. And so this was basically they had influence with Americans previously, and that influence had been positive. So when the Detachment 101 folks came in and basically set up shop, one of the things they did, and they wouldn't even know how to spell the term civil affairs, but one of the things they did was make sure that the local Kachin population was taken care of. So they did this with medical care. When basically supplies were airdropped to them, they would sell the parachutes to the Kachins because they did not have access to cloth anymore, and essentially, did everything they could to ingratiate themselves to the local population, and it worked.
Now, with the guerrilla warfare campaign, you rarely have major battles to mark it by. But could you please give us a description of how Detachment 101 with its Kachin allies fought and operated during this period, and in the end, what they achieved?
The Kachins did not believe in open warfare, and that suited how the OSS was going to fight very well. So essentially what they would do is the Kachins were masters of the area that they were in. They knew all the local trails. They knew where the Japanese were. And so what they would do is when they knew there was a Japanese movement that was coming, they would set up on a trail and essentially do a hit and run ambush. So in many cases, if a Japanese column was coming up a trail, the Kachins would stay long enough to fire off a magazine, or in some cases they had black powder muzzle loaders. They would shoot one shot and then melt into the jungle. And in this way, the Japanese could not follow, and they would do these pinprick attacks consistently throughout that area of operations. And it got so that the Japanese were extremely scared to move down some of these trails because they did not know when those ambushes would occur.
And what effect did this have on Japanese control in northern Burma at this time?
In the early days, not much. It was basically a pinprick campaign that later matured, and it matures once American forces can take the initiative in northern Burma. And this is with a group well known as the Merrill's Marauders, because Stilwell wanted to capture Michinaw. The reason why he wanted to capture it is the airfield there. Basically, Japanese fighters were intercepting Allied cargo aircraft that were taking supplies to China. And that forced the Allied planes to divert. And by diverting, they could carry less supplies because they had to carry more fuel. So if they could have a straighter route, basically passing by Michinaw, then they could get more supplies to China. And so as American combat forces come into the area, augmented by Chinese combat forces, then Detachment 101, because they're not sitting there on their own, can become more and more bold in the attacks that they're able to do.
Let's talk about this part of the war a little bit more. You mentioned that American forces came in to take the initiative. Now, there were two other special operations forces operating in what was then known as the China-Burma-India Theater. You mentioned one, the American force Merrill Marauders under General Frank Merrill. There was a British force also under General Ord Wingate, known as the Chindits. Could you explain to our listeners what these two other special forces units were and how they contributed to the fight in Burma during World War II?
The first one to go in were the Chindits. There were two Chindit expeditions. The first one goes in at the same time that the A group that I had mentioned had gone in. And at the time, there had not been liaison between the British and Detachment 101. So when the A group team goes in, they had no idea that there were Chindits already on the ground. This actually helped them escape a little bit because the Japanese did not concentrate necessarily to fight the A group because they thought they were part of the Chindit expedition. That first Chindit expedition went in was more of a morale builder for British forces because the British had been thoroughly routed out of Burma. And this was kind of a way to build up morale again. The effects were not strategic in what it accomplished. And the Chindits were forced to walk back out of Burma because the Japanese were able to fight them off. But the second Chindit expedition was coordinated with the attack of Merrill's Marauders, and this was a campaign in northern Burma to capture Michinaw. And so in this case, the Merrill's Marauders set off overland by foot, and the Chindits are brought in by glider near Mogong, which is south of Michinaw. And what the Chindits were trying to do is essentially cut all the rail traffic and reinforcement into Michinaw, while the Marauders could then surprise Japanese forces there and take the city, along with the Chinese forces that were with them as well. So you have two special operations forces that are involved in the battle for Michinaw, and Detachment 101 is supporting both of them. Det 101 at first is supplying intelligence on Japanese movements, but later they're able to grow their guerrilla forces and become a maneuver guerrilla element where by May 1944, the Marauders are fixed at Michinaw because it turns into a siege situation, and the Chindits are fixed near Mogong because they're sitting aside those, essentially the rail lines trying to block it. And so the only maneuver element you have left is Detachment 101, and they're able to range over whatever Japanese supply lines remain and sever those to isolate the Japanese garrison at Michinaw.
At its peak at this time, approximately how many Kachin guerrillas is Detachment 101 supporting?
At its peak, around 10,000. At this time, no more than a couple thousand.
And this was the main maneuver force that was able to help both Merrill's Marauders and Ord Wingate's Chindits, correct?
Correct, absolutely. And Detachment 101 had learned its lesson from the first Chindit expedition, and it actually assigned a Kachin team and two Americans that went in by glider with the Chindits. And so there was liaison on the ground with the Chindits so they could coordinate all the movements of the various Detachment 101 forces.
And at this time, for our listeners to also kind of visualize, these OSS Detachment 101 personnel were living in the bush with their Kachin allies. They were behind Japanese lines. Could you describe what life was like for these OSS operators? How they got supplied, how they lived, how they communicated?
Supplies were airdropped. What they could do is they could radio requests back to Nazira, which is in Assam, India, and that was the Detachment 101 headquarters. So they could radio for supplies. A lot of those supplies would be ammunition, but they could also get clothing, shoes, things like that, whatever they needed. But you're right, they did have to live behind the lines. In many cases, this could be months or years that they live there. There are several Detachment 101 veterans that actually learned how to speak Jingpo, which is so they could communicate with their Kachin soldiers. And in some cases, they adopted some of the local styles. They definitely had to learn to like the local food, and the more they could ingratiate themselves to their native hosts, the better it went for them. So one of the things that the Americans definitely had to do was, in many cases, put reservations aside as far as what they were going to eat, where they were going to sleep, and how they were going to live, and live like the locals do.
And there was the Detachment 101 headquarters in Burma. And then there was the forward forces there excuse me, Detachment 101 headquarters in India,
India.
and then the forward units in Burma. Could you give our listeners an idea of the size or maybe the small size of these detachments?
At this time, you're probably talking about no more than 100 American personnel in Detachment 101. This would be around May 1944. So your maneuver elements at the time, you may have a group of 3 to 5 Americans. And what they're essentially doing is they're acting as the commanders of the guerrilla units. And then what they did is, because many of the Kachins that fought with them had prior been members of the Burma Rifles or the Kachin Rifles under the British, they knew the British rank system for the area. And so they adapted that rank system. So they had Jemadars and Havildars as their rank system, not the American rank system. And so they organized the Kachin forces in how essentially the veterans of the previous Burma army would have understood, and that made things go much smoother because there was an absolute language barrier, and in some cases there were no English-speaking Kachins and no Kachin-speaking Americans in the unit. So they had to make things as simple as they possibly could to reduce all the confusion.
So you had these small teams of 3 to 5 Americans, probably several of them, but not many, combined with the headquarters supporting them in India, who eventually ended up controlling 10,000 guerrillas in the region.
Correct. And so your guerrilla groups could be anywhere from 50 to a couple hundred guerrillas at a time. So not a lot of an American imprint on the ground, but by going out and being able to recruit amongst the local population, Detachment 101 is a tremendous force multiplier.
And then as the war continued in Burma, as the tide turned, as the British forces, which are predominant in the area, grew stronger, they conducted conventional military attacks along the coast in Burma. Then they finally took Rangoon as the war was coming to an end. What was the contribution to Detachment 101 to this effort, the war in Burma from 1942 to 1945?
So from 1942, they're the some of the first elements to go into northern Burma. They prepare the area and this is not the right term, but what I'll call conventional units coming in. So I know the Marauders are not a conventional unit. They're a long-range penetration group, but to Detachment 101, they were the conventional unit. They are preparing the ground for them to be able to seize their objective. During the Michoud campaign, Detachment 101 is isolating Michoud to allow the conventional forces to secure that town. And then after the fall of Michoud in August 1944, Detachment 101 and its guerrillas start pushing south. For several months, they're actually the only Allied troops that are in contact with Japanese forces. Then we move into southern operations along the Arakan coast into Burma, which becomes a secondary mission for Detachment 101, where elements of Det 101 provide reconnaissance forces for British troops marching down the peninsula, and they help them secure Rangoon. The element there was called the Arakan Field Unit. At the same time, there are still operations going on in North Burma. So they do help. There's a follow-on long-range penetration group to the Marauders called the Mars Task Force. The Mars Task Force finally secures the Burma Road in North Burma, and Detachment 101 operates with Mars Task Force, much like they did with Merrill's Marauders, by supplying Kachins to serve as guides and accompanying guerrilla forces. Mars Task Force secures the Burma Road, and then is moved on to China by early 1944 or 1945. And then this leaves Detachment 101 as the only combat element left in the Northern Combat Area Command. So they then kind of adopt a conventional role as conventional infantry and keep pushing the Japanese away from the Burma Road to make sure that they can't interdict it at any point. So Detachment 101 goes from, in 1942, basically infiltration, to 1945, they are the conventional force in theater.
So it was an incredible story. And at the end, they achieved the strategic goal of both the United States and the United Kingdom of reopening up the Burma Road to allow supplies to come into China. Granted, this was at the very end of the war, but most people didn't know that the war was going to end in August of 45 because of the atomic bomb. If that had not worked, China was still going to be a major player in keeping the Japanese occupied so we could invade Japan. Overall, could you give me just a summary of what Detachment 101 achieved and what happened at the end of the war and the demobilization and what was the fate of both the Kachins and the American OSS counterparts?
By the end of the war, Detachment 101, I think you can successfully credit it with the majority of the intelligence that was furnished to the Northern Combat Area Command. They also rescued, it's known that they rescued over 200 Allied pilots and another couple hundred Allied personnel that had been shot down in the jungle, were able to secure them. It's estimated they killed 10,000 of the enemy for a loss of only a few personnel. And what they were able to do is they were able to do this very cheaply, both in terms of loss of life and in terms of expense. Burma was a very under-resourced theater, and Detachment 101 essentially did what they could with what they had, and did a very good job of it. After the war, so Detachment 101 wraps up its operations in July in 1945. Some of the Detachment 101 members had been there since 1942 or early 1943, and they went home. Other ones then went on to China to further the war there, because as you said, we didn't know about the atomic bomb, so we kept pressing the Japanese in China. But the Kachins themselves, Detachment 101, really thought this one out. And so the British were wary of having armed organizations of guerrillas Yeah, because they wanted to have Burma become a British colony again, and the Kachins were not exactly, they weren't anti-British, but they weren't pro-British. But there were a lot of other ethnic groups that Detachment 101 fought with that were not exactly pro-British. And so one of the conditions that the British wanted Detachment 101 to do was to demobilize the guerrillas. And so what Detachment 101 did is they had mustering out ceremonies in which they held a large party or manau, allowed the villagers to bring their families in, made sure that they were well fed, had a dance, had celebrations, and made it a formal event for them to stack their arms and return to civilian life. And then what Det 101 did too is they arranged to have their guerrillas, some of whom were hundreds of miles from home, have them flown back as near as they could to their home areas. Um, the relations with the Americans and the Kachins in particular outlasted the war, and the veterans, especially the ones that I dealt with and was friends with, were very adamant that they should continue to support the Kachin in their endeavors. This was difficult for them to do because of the status of relations between the United States and Burma, but in particular because of the relations between the Kachin state and Burma. There has been a series of ongoing conflicts since the end of the war there. And so it was difficult for the Americans to convince the Rangoon government that they wanted to go back and help the Kachin. But once they were able to convince the Burmese to allow them to go back in, they basically paid for orphanages, they paid for elder care for some of the Kachin veterans, and they also tried to initiate through the U.S. Department of State a crop substitution program to essentially reduce opium production and teach the Kachin farmers how to grow crops to more efficiently.
And 80 years later, the Kachin people are still in news as they fight a guerrilla war, and they have for decades, against central authority in Burma.
Absolutely, and it's unfortunately it's a very volatile situation there. I did go to northern Burma in the early 2000s, and the reception that we got in the Michinaw area was just fantastic. The Kachin had definitely not forgotten the support that the Americans had given them during the war.
Troy, you're now the command historian for the U.S. Special Operations Command. You're a historian with CIA. Obviously, these organizations have such departments as to learn from their past. Summarize and to wrap up our discussion today, what do you think is the most important lessons we can learn from the OSS experience in Burma with regards to future irregular warfare operations?
So it's kind of a joke that we have here that there's no future in history, in that it's hard. I'm glad I got the laugh, but it's hard to look at situations and apply them to the future. But I think you can draw some generalizations from the war in Burma. Number one, I think is bureaucracy. So Detachment 101 had none. Now that can be good, that can be bad, but they were allowed to have the independence on their own to see what needed to be done and to do it. Another thing they also had, which was a strength, even though they didn't see it at the time, was lack of resources. So because they weren't showered with material, they really had to think things through of how they were going to accomplish their mission with less. And that allowed them to be truly innovative in some of the ways that they were able to prosecute the war. And so, and the last thing I think you can talk about is, you know, when you look at World War II and a lot of the special operations endeavors in World War II, they're really kind of short-term functions. So one that gets a lot of notoriety in this community in particular are the Jedburghs in France. And when you look at Jedburgh operations, they jump into France after D-Day, June 6th. They basically jump into France from June through the last team went in November 1944. But in some cases, the Jedburgh teams are overrun by conventional forces within days or weeks. So they did not have
And that's U.S. conventional
yeah,
forces that
U.S.
advance so
conventional
rapidly.
forces. Yeah, correct. Um, but the point of that being is that they didn't have time to develop relationships with the locals that they were working with. When you look at Burma, where you had people that were in Burma from 1942 to 1945, they have 3 years to develop these relationships. Same thing with the Philippine guerrillas, who, again, 1942 to 1945, they're able to integrate themselves into the local communities, become part of them, and convince the locals that yes, you do want to help us, and yes, you do want to fight against the enemy. So basically, just time on the ground and relationships is one thing that you can bring away from Detachment 101.
Well, Troy, I want to thank you for a truly fascinating discussion. I mean, we could continue on. There are so many lessons to learn. One of the things that most people don't consider that you touched upon is the difficulty in demobilizing a guerrilla force. That is one of the hardest things to do and do successfully to get people who've been fighting and killing for years to stop and to turn in their weapons. It's fraught with military and political possibilities for things to go wrong. But OSS Detachment 101 did a successful job in that, and many other examples here. I would really suggest to our listeners who are learning more about OSS Detachment 101 to check out Dr. Sacquety's book, The OSS in Burma, Jungle Warfare Against the Japanese. Troy, thanks again for being with us, and thank you to our Overheard podcast audience for listening. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org. Thanks again, and goodbye.